Today I'm going to reflect on the relationship between matter and light. And we start with, of course, the equation that Einstein gave us of E equal to mc squared, which gives a relationship already between mass and the speed of light. But the question is, how might we formulate a relationship between matter and light? Now, a couple of weeks ago, I had derived an equation for emergence in space-time, and that's where I'm going to begin. So just quickly summarizing, if we consider the speed of light at our physical or untransformed layer, then that we had posited that creates a certain reality due to the speed being finite of a past, present, future, and of relationship between isolated masses at that level of reality. So we may summarize that as past, present, future, and relationship. And further, we may call that, we refer to this as the physical, vital, mental, and integral, because anything that's in the past maintains a status quo. Anything in the present is a play of forces, so it's vital. Anything in the future is in seed form, so it's a mental idea. And integrality is achieved by considering the lower bound of Planck's constant, and that really gives forth a reality of matter not dissipating, which means there's a relationship between isolated islands of matter. But then the question is, we had also looked at, if we know, for instance, that when we go into the quantum level, that there's more of a reality of waves as opposed to particles, and wave would imply that Planck's constant is even smaller, which would imply that theoretically the speed of light is higher. So we're talking about a different kind of abstract layer behind the physical, where the speed of light creates something that's different. And so we had referred to that as CN, N being some abstract layer above the untransformed layer. And if we project that trend forward of increasing speed, we can hypothesize we have a place where perhaps C is infinite. And if it were infinite, then past, present, future would meld, and that light that existed at that layer would know everything intimately and completely, right there, right then. So it would be an infinite intelligence, infinite loving, infinite presence. And we hypothesize that these four properties that may show up in this layer of reality as we experience it are kind of precipitations from some more fundamental principles of the system that we exist in. And we had, correspondingly to these four, suggested that there's presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So we have implicit at any instant in that reality where you have C infinite, there's an infinite intelligence, an infinite knowing, an infinite presence, an infinite loving, and infinite power. And the question is, how does that fundamental nature of reality at that abstract layer where the speed of light is infinite precipitate to this visible layer as we experience it? And we had hypothesized that there's some kind of play of some seed characteristics becoming infinite, which means that if we consider CK some intermediate layer between Cn and C infinite, then we can hypothesize that at CK we have the sets of presence, sets of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, which are infinite sets, and that defines the reality. So we have architectural forces that become the sources of precipitation or innovation that have an infinite variety along those four fundamental dimensions. And we may say that this precipitation is such that Ck is a function of, or rather the reality at Ck is a function of the reality at C infinite. And similarly, if we were to then think about this layer Cn, we may say that the reality at Cn is a function of the reality at Ck. And when we think about this layer, it's really where we have infinite number of seeds that are created from these vast four different sets. And so we may notate that as any unique seed being a function of the intermingling of these four sets. So the set of presence times the set of power times set of knowledge times the set of harmony, and further this reality that we experience here, reality at Cu, is some function of the reality at Cn. And so this is what this is suggesting, is that light plays a fundamental part in the reality that we experience, and that light perhaps has different stances. And at this layer where we know that the untransformed layer, where we have light moving at 186,000 miles per second, that's symbolic of a certain reality that it creates. And similarly, as light increases in speed, there's a different reality that solidifies or crystallizes at that different speed, which we may or may not experience based on the kind of opening of perception that we have. But when we think about, so what we're talking about here is an equation for the emergence in space-time of any organization, and so light is that fundamental matrix. But then the question is, how does this manifest in space and time? So if we think about in space, so in space we have basically any point in space is going to have an infinite variety, but we represent at the untransformed layer dynamics of X untransformed. So it's a set where X may be physical, vital, mental, or integral, so in four different dimensions. And so there's an initial set XU. So perhaps if we think about the physical aspect, it might be things like inertia and wanting to maintain power as it was and so on. And the question, so there's a number of patterns that exist at this layer, and when we begin to break these patterns, which I'll refer to P to the base X, then the second, this layer here, which we'll call meta level 1, becomes active. And if it becomes active, then we have the dynamics of signature X, so the signatures behind these four fundamental dimensions here. And as this signature becomes more of a force, then we have the conditions for greater interaction with meta level 2, which are these architectural forces, these sets of forces. So we refer to that as some system property large X, where X refers to these four sets, one of the four sets. And if this force then becomes integral, meaning that it can act with impunity within any time-space bound, then we have the conditions for this layer N3 becoming active, where we have these four fundamental properties of the system acting at any single point in space-time. So this is how emergence in space may take place. And then when we think about the emergence the time dimension of this, or the time matrix, we may say that M3 is active at all time, and M2 is active at time 0, but then all the way through infinite time. M1 is active at some point greater than 0 and all the way to infinity, and U becomes active at time 13.8 10 to the 9. So here, when we're talking about U, we're talking about organizations that have cellular structure as their basis, and we know that cells emerge perhaps roughly about 13.8 times 10 to the 9 years from the supposed Big Bang. And at this point we have what we're calling the transformation circle, the way in which this untransformed set becomes the transformed set that's proceeding in the direction from M3 to U. So there's kind of an automaticity and its intelligence that dictates how things evolve. And then at some time 13.8 to the 10 to the 9, where it's so here we have greater than or equal to, here we have greater than, and the transformation function reverses that direction so that the notion of will becomes active. So it's UM3, it's in this direction, so that's how things emerge in time. And then we're talking about the action of this transformation circle, which would indicate how fast this integration of these several metal layers takes place. And that essentially creates a transform set x to the t. And as we had suggested, this whole thing is recursive, so that at any point beyond this point, xu has at its starting point the previous transform set xt. And this is how we had defined the emergence in space-time. So if we think about this practically, we can say that there are, taking our cue from these four fundamental orientations, when we think about the layer of light, as we've said, or the notion of these properties in light, we have past, present, future, and connection. And the kind of master principles, if you will, are that of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And when we think about an electromagnetic spectrum, which light is perhaps an instant of, or EM is an electromagnetic spectrum is an instant of light, we have its ability to create mass as falling under this presence aspect, its energy gradient, the implicit energy gradient across the electromagnetic spectrum as the power aspect. We have the fundamental archetypes of wavelength and frequency that may span all the way from radio waves to gamma rays and perhaps more in each direction, which create the archetypes of the different waves that are possible. And then we have the speed of the electromagnetic spectrum that itself creates this sense of relationship. And then if we think about the quantum level, we had suggested that the presence aspect is reflected in the Higgs boson, the power aspect is reflected in leptons, the knowledge aspect in quarks, and the harmony aspect in bosons, the other bosons besides the Higgs boson. And then when we think about atoms, we had similarly said that the presence aspect is figured in those atoms that have the d probability cloud around the nucleus, so that's the d shell. The power aspect is represented by the s shell, the knowledge aspect by the p shell, and the harmony aspect by the f shell. And then if we think about cellular structure, we have the presence aspect reflected in proteins, in the molecular plan of proteins, the power aspect by the molecular plan of polysaccharides, the knowledge aspect in the molecular plan of nucleic acids, and the harmony aspect in the molecular plan of lipids. And so we have here, as a direct result of considering how light creates emergence, we have this aspect of matter as we know it from the electromagnetic spectrum itself down to cellular structure, which creates all the beings that we have around us, that create all the organizations that we have around us, and so that we see that matter is a function of light, modulated, if you will, by the play of the untransformed meta level 1, meta level 2, and meta level 3 layers. And so, whereas in our initial starting point, we had Einstein's equation equal to mc squared that gives a relationship between mass in matter and the speed of light. Here we're positing an equation that suggests how matter, any kind of matter, is itself a result of light through the modulation of these different layers that emanate out from different realities of light, if you will.